Hello and welcome to Africa Amplified, Bloomberg's monthly show bringing Africa's story to the world. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja here in Johannesburg. For the next half hour, we'll dive into some of the continent's top stories affecting markets, including a look at South Africa's historic election. The May vote saw the African National Congress lose its parliamentary majority for the first time since the end of apartheid 30 years ago. Markets were on edge and still are as the country enters a new political era. And the ANC contends with the reality that it must negotiate with its rivals to govern. Political economist Moeletsi Mbeki joins us later in the show here on set to discuss South Africa's prospects. We're also going to look at the currency challenges facing multiple African nations. On one hand, some nations are struggling to combat illegal FX trades, while others grapple with calls to depart from a currency with a tainted legacy. It is a busy morning for us, but first, let's bring you up to speed on some of the main stories from across the continent. We're going to bring you news from Abuja in the west and Kigali in the east, but let's start here in Johannesburg. As we mentioned, leaders of the ANC have met to discuss how it will work with its rivals after last month's election failed to produce an outright winner. President Cyril Ramaphosa said, quote, "The moment calls for the broadest unity of the people of South Africa."
As the ANC, with its 40% return of votes, cannot really set up government without cooperating with others. We will not preclude the possibility of working with any party so long as it is in the public interest and it is in keeping with the principles that they have articulated.
And now to Nigeria, where two of the country's largest labor federations, actually, we're going to stick on this story in particular and talk about South Africa and what is happening here. And we have here Cele. She is one of our reporters from the politics and eco team here in South Africa. Cele, you have been on this story for years, for months, really. Can you just talk to us about really the breakthrough that we saw last night and some of the comments that we heard from President Ramaphosa there?
So I think all eyes were on the ANC. The highest decision-making body met yesterday, and they decided on a government of national unity, which would essentially see them extend an invite to members of the opposition parties to join them to form this government. It was a heated conversation in that meeting, to say the very least, and there's different ideologies that are at play within the ANC, different contestation around ideas. But basically what we're going to see over the next few days is ANC negotiating team going to the main opposition, the Democratic Alliance, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and other parties to extend this this opportunity, rather, to form a government. What is going to be interesting to see, though, is which of those accept the opportunity to join and which do not. The markets, of course, we know favour a tie-up with the Democratic Alliance, but they've said that they are not willing to work with the Economic Freedom Fighters. And so I guess the ANC has, in some respects, pushed the ball back in the courts of the opposition parties, kind of refusing to make a decision, which is a little bit typical, I think, of President Cyril Ramaphosa.
So then what happens next? What are you paying attention to next? I mean, is it really what the next move is from these opposition parties? Have we heard anything from them at this point?
So the turnaround time is really, really tight since the elections. The results were announced this past Sunday. There are 14 days in which a government must be formed. Parliament will convene to elect a speaker as well as a president. And so really they've got about 10 days now to go back to these other parties and say, this is where we've landed. Can we agree on this? And sort of find a compromise or a common ground.
Is there a risk for investors? I mean, I haven't taken a look at where the rand is going to be today, but I mean, could this potentially have some upside if we are going to see all of these parties come together, or what would you say?
The rand has kind of been all over the place, and I think there's been a sense that working with the Economic Freedom Fighters, who are now the fourth biggest party, would be a bit risky. But still, Ramaphosa has outlined that this would not be an ad hoc arrangement. It would be something that would be in writing, and they would only be speaking with parties that will meet certain requirements, including upholding the Constitution and the rule of law. And so I think he's seeing that as somewhat of a safeguard that should give some level of certainty and policy continuity and stability to the markets and South Africans at large.
Yeah, and we know you're going to be all over that. Cele, thank you so much for that update there. And now, we mentioned this at the top of the show, let's turn to Nigeria, where two of the country's largest labor federations are in talks with the government, hoping to agree on a new minimum wage. This is after union strikes had temporarily led to power power grids shutting down and disruptions at key airports. For more, let's get to Bloomberg's Nigeria bureau chief, Anthony Osei-Brown, who's also been following this story. So, Anthony, give us the latest on this workers' strike and what kind of impact this new minimum wage could have if it actually is agreed upon.
Yeah, so the labor unions were on strike on Monday. Currently, after that strike, the government ordered the finance minister to prepare a proposal for the minimum wage. That has been done. I understand. Reports that yesterday the finance minister was with the president with the proposal. The expectation is that they will possibly go back to labor this morning with a counter proposal. The strike was caused by the huge difference between the government's stand on what should be the minimum wage and the labor unions. The government was offering $40 a month, and labor unions are asking for $330 a month. So they will now have to, the government will put a new proposal on the table, hopefully this weekend, and then meet with the government, meet with the labor unions, and possibly agree on a new minimum wage. Labor suspended the strike; they didn't call it off. They are suspending it for 5 days, and if an agreement is not reached, maybe by Monday, then labor may resume the strike again.
And Anthony, it's interesting because just a few days ago, we were talking about President Tinubu's 1 year in office. Early on, investors were very pleased with some of the reforms that he was making. But I wonder now, considering these strikes, considering the fuel subsidies being on and off, and a lot of the other issues that have been affecting Nigeria, what does this say about his first year in office?
Yeah, so it shows the mixed outcomes in the first year in the office. Why investors are happy with the reforms, which are necessary to restore the economic growth. The outcome for the ordinary man on the street and workers has been quite devastating. Inflation is at a 28-year high. In fact, foodstuffs have more than tripled in prices, and the naira has depreciated by over 70%. That has caused actual pain on the street. A lot of people are struggling to survive. The current minimum wage is just about $17 or less, and that has caused a lot of pain. Transportation prices have more than tripled. So a lot of people are feeling pain on the street. So while the economic reforms are necessary to restore economic growth, the impact on the street has not been very strong, very good for the people.
Right. Anthony Osei-Brown joining us, our Nigeria bureau chief there. Anthony, thanks so much for waking up very early with us. And we also mentioned this other story. African policymakers in several countries are cracking down on street dealers offering foreign exchange as they look to defend their currencies. Let's bring in our reporter, Bloomberg's Ndira Oganga, who is in Kigali for us. Ndira, you have been closely watching this. I mean, how far are African governments willing to go to rein in the currency depreciation? Because there's a number of countries where this is pretty prolific happening on the street.
Jennifer, by hook or crook, the currency must appreciate and speculation must stop. We're seeing them cracking down on these street dealers because central banks are actually running out of options to defend their currencies. This is happening in countries like Nigeria, Zambia, South Sudan, where they've been harassing dealers, arrested them, imposed very hefty fines, and even gone as far as revising FX regulations. Ghana is the latest country to join this bloc where the central bank has banned dealers from advertising their rates outside their premises and social media, saying this is driving speculation. And if we look at all these countries, what they have in common is a very vibrant parallel market. And this is not great for investors because it just shows that these countries have volatile currencies and nobody wants to invest in a currency where in a country rather where the currency is not stable.
Yeah, and we're taking a look at some of those countries there that you're talking about, Ndiro. We're still seeing Africa really poised to be the fastest growing region behind Asia in 2025. What is going to drive this growth, especially if this is sort of getting in the way of any sort of growth of a lot of these economies?
Jennifer, important to note is that global economic conditions are improving, and that's trickling down back to the region. And several regions are expected to drive this growth, first of all being East Africa, 4.9% growth this year and 5.7% next year. And this is attributed to strong government spending, strategic investment in infrastructure, which is in turn improving connectivity and trade, and also modernization of agriculture. And this growth cuts across the continent. We're likely to see 40 economies grow, 17 of them growing by over 5%. And if we zoom in into a region like West Africa, 4.2% growth this year, driven by their bigger economies, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire, and Central Africa, driven by DRC and Chad because of projected higher metal prices. However, there are still risks such as geopolitical tension, regional instability, and also adverse weather conditions that could hamper this projected growth.
Absolutely. Thanks so much to Indira Oganga in Kigali. Indira, always great to get your reporting. All right, coming up, negotiations continue in South Africa on the formation of a new government. We're going to speak exclusively to the economist and political analyst Moeletsi Mbeki. He's here in studio with us next. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
Yes, in developing countries like South Africa, when there is, one-party dominance for too long, we don't get that economic growth, we don't get accountability, and then South Africa has been very clear. ANC has been in power for too long and too complacent. The market reforms that we needed, the structural reforms that we needed, there was up to now no seriousness to do that because voters up to now voted the ANC in despite the ANC's performance and often based on the ANC's past as a movement against apartheid. And I think the uncertainty that we're now getting really brings the accountability.
That was South African political commentator William Gumede on why he believes South Africa needs a change of leadership, which is somewhat what we are seeing right now. And my next guest also believes the ANC's decline has been a long time coming. I'm pleased to be joined by Moeletsi Mbeki. He is the chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs, joining me here on set. So, Moeletsi, so much to talk about. Let's just start with maybe priority number one to get this economy back on track. We saw first quarter GDP, the economy contracted slightly. What does this new government need to prioritize?
Well, there are two major obstacles to the South African economy. One are the companies that are owned by the state, which are the logistics companies, which control the railways and control the ports and used to control the airlines. These companies have more or less collapsed in the hands of the ANC government. And this has created a major problem for the trade industry in South Africa. The collapse of the railway industry has meant that to transport minerals, we are a mineral exporter, such as coal, such as granite, to transport iron ore. Mining companies are having to use trucks. And this is very expensive and very inefficient. So that has to be priority number one. Priority number two is the supply of electricity. Supply of electricity in South Africa is controlled by a state-owned company. And this has completely failed to keep up with the demand. So we're having blackouts. We have been having blackouts for the last 17 years in our economy.
Right, but they've improved slightly over the past few months.
Yes, but for industry, 2 months or 3 months, you can't plan a new manufacturing industry on the basis of an improvement in 2 months. It has to be reliable over the long term. The third obstacle to investment is the policy of the ANC government called Black Economic Empowerment.
Right.
That is one of the major obstacles.
Right. So then, so Moeletsi, I was going to ask you, I mean, we heard last night the ANC has agreed on this government of national unity. How would you advise them now that they have made this agreement, and especially if we think about the opposition parties that are now potentially going to be a part of this coalition?
Well, at the end of the day, the opposition parties have to accept the ANC's solution to these problems.
But they've said they don't want to.
Well, that's why we don't really know which of the many political parties that are in parliament will actually join this government of national unity. Because the ANC and the ANC president, Mr. Ramaphosa, has made it very clear that, for example, the policy of black economic empowerment is non-negotiable. It is a key pillar of ANC policy. Now, will the opposition parties accept the continuation of this policy? Some will say yes, others say no.
What's your expectation then? Do you believe that we'll see all of these parties come together?
I don't think so. I think there will be some. Already one of them has announced, Action South Africa, Action SA, has announced that it will not join a partnership with the ANC or a coalition with the ANC or a national unity government with the ANC. So it's clear we are now entering the final straight, and it's going to be very, very complex who joins. But the ANC only has 10 days to sort out this problem.
Yeah, and we were having Simbile talk about that earlier. I mean, we've also been seeing a lot of volatility when it comes to bonds, obviously the Rand and the benchmark stock index here. Does that volatility continue, or do you think that it might subside as we get closer and closer to that 2-week deadline?
Yeah, well, as you know, our currency is very volatile. And I expect this will continue until there is final agreement.
What do you think it will get to then?
The Rand sometimes goes down as far down as 19 and below to the US dollar. So I can expect any of those scenarios.
So then what changes that trajectory then? I mean, what gets the Rand strengthening again?
I think what will get the Rand to stabilize is the agreement, especially between, that includes the ANC and its two breakaway parties, which is the Economic Freedom Fighters and the Umkhonto weSizwe MK party. Those are the two critical players to agree to be part of the, instead of staying in the opposition.
But that's what investors were concerned about, especially when we think about some of the policies of the EFF and the MK, like nationalizing the Reserve Bank and mines. It sounds like you're saying them being a part of the government of national unity will end up stabilizing the economy?
Oh, it will stabilize the economy. There's a lot of exaggerated fears in South Africa about the economic freedom fighters. They're not as radical as many people think they are. They believe, which is an old African nationalist belief, that the state must play a prominent role in the economy. But when it actually comes to practice, as I have pointed out, the state has been an obstacle. State-owned industries have been an obstacle to the performance of the South African economy. Economic freedom fighters know that as well as I do. So they understand that there has to be a private sector participation in the key logistics and power generation industries.
Yeah, and we are seeing more private sector investment coming in. Thank you so much for your time. Moeletsi Mbeki, chairman of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Really appreciate you coming in. All right, coming up, we're going to take a look at calls for reform of the CFA Franc's currencies at the heart of trade across large portions of the continent. But some say they're tainted with a colonial past. We're going to dig into that. This is Bloomberg. The CFA Francs, seen by critics as a tainted legacy of French colonialism in Africa. Fraught with controversy, many wish to abolish the currencies, yet they also have their supporters. The two CFA francs are used by 14 Central and West African nations, with a combined population of almost 200 million people and GDP of $283 billion. Introduced by Paris in the aftermath of World War II, they were designed to foster exports from France into these countries. They also made African exports to France more expensive and therefore less competitive, hampering these nations' development.
The CFA franc is symbolic of the ties to France that are from pre-colonial times. The fact that the monetary policy of the countries with the currency is effectively outsourced to the European Central Bank also undermines the sovereignty of those particular countries.
But advocates say the system has promoted monetary stability and kept inflation low in these nations. Since 2020, anti-French sentiment across parts of the two currency zones contributed to a series of military coups. The juntas installed in those countries have drawn popular support by promising to move away from the CFA.
The currency can be replaced with a national currency. So each of the member countries of the existing monetary union could have its own currency. But ahead of that, you need to have the institutional arrangements, most importantly, a national central bank.
So while many call for discontinuing the CFA francs, there's no guarantee change will happen anytime soon. That was a quick look at the complicated histories of the CFA francs in Africa. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Yinka Ibukan. Yinka, you've covered this extensively. I mean, how has this conversation changed over time to reform the currency?
So yes, there's a momentum now for the change, for some sort of reform to happen, although it's been an issue ever since independence for most of these countries. And so one of the ways that that was done was that France was removed from the board of the West African Central Bank, the CAO, a few years ago, and the reserve requirements were changed in such a way that the bank had more control over how it spent the actual reserves. But given how much it's been talked about, the change has been pretty superficial, and that's part of the frustration that's fueling new movements, new calls really for the currency to be either removed but at least reformed.
And Yinka, in just about 10 seconds, I mean, what is the next thing to watch out for then with this discussion?
I think Senegal is an interesting country to look out for, just because it had said there's a new democratic government there, and if before it came into office, it did say that it was one of the plan was to remove the currency, but it's moderated its speech. So that's one country to definitely look out for.
All right. Bloomberg's Yinka Ibukan. Yinka, thanks so much. That's all we have time for today. Join us next month.